thank you very much, Yancy, and thank you everybody around the room. It's such a pleasure and privilege, thank you, to be addressing this type of audience, which I would not normally be addressing, but I guess something in my CV justified getting me here. So thank you very much, and it's really wonderful. I've really enjoyed engaging with the data, the information that is in the program, and in the book that is in the program. Thank you very much for that. And let's see where this presentation and discussion takes us. Mine is specifically on theme 2, and so I will just focus on that particular theme and details of these attitudes, what we call attitudes of promise and reservation towards science and technology, modern and traditional, that live in the hearts and minds and experiences of South Africans, and we see these experiences all around us. And here's mine. Thank you very much. And so, just as orientation, what we're looking at here is modern science and technology, and what the report refers to as traditional science and technology. It could also perhaps be denominated science and technology turned into traditional knowledge when we speak about these comparatives. So that is what I do here, just on these specific attitudes, and how there I briefly conceptualize promise, the potential benefits, the hopes, the prospects associated with these attitudes towards science and technology. On the other hand, also then the reservations. What are the concerns, the risks, the fears, the cynicisms that South Africa has about science and technology? The conventional definition of science and technology is very much depicted in these word clouds that are in this lovely HSRC and its partners report. So that doesn't need much additional explanation. On the other hand, there is this concept of traditional science and technology, which I actually prefer, and many places in the report and already in presentations, we've seen that it's referred to as traditional knowledge, which is really a composite of various different phenomena, experiences we see around us in society. Think, for example, of beliefs, in terms of beliefs, cultures, communal life, beliefs also about communal life, about food production in those communities, skills that are passed on between generations within a community. So there are many different phenomena that are really designated in this concept of traditional science and technology or traditional knowledge. And the future point for development in this work may very well to unpack and differentiate the internal dimensions of that concept further. So this is just a basic orientation. Let's get into the nitty-gritty now of these attitudes. And I mentioned just now, it's really about the architecture, the structures of these very important attitudes towards science and technology. And as a brief, just in terms of my quick agenda for the day, I will go into what are these, by 2022 snapshot, what are the attitudes that South Africans have? I will also look at, I think that is very important, how these have been changing over time. Because as you will see as the presentation unfolds, some of the promises that are held at very high level, perhaps even the highest level in a 2022 survey, have actually been shedding following in the minds of South Africans since that period, since the previous survey of 2013. And so that dimension of change that comes in here is very important, and I will emphasize that quite a bit. And then I also briefly compare the South Africans' attitudes with those internationally, with a few other countries for which information is available. And I will also look at the demographic designations of the people who have these beliefs. And it's very complex beliefs. It's not either ors in South Africans' minds. People who are very high on cynicism about science and technology and modern science and technology may very well have high cynicism about it as well. So affirmations and cynicisms, which basically demonstrates that many South Africans have got their ear to the ground and they understand the phenomenon because it is a very complex phenomenon. But I think it is reassuring that South Africans do have these complex attitudes about science and technology. And that is a reality that we have to work within if we look at what are things that we can change. What are tasks that there remain for us to effect? And these two questions which the organizers have helped me extract from this theme for our discussion can basically go around, and I ask you to bear these two questions in mind as I do the rest of this brief presentation. What needs to happen in South Africa to help people understand the promise or the benefits of modern science and technology? And a second question would be, what needs to happen in South Africa to address reservations, concerns, cynicisms, disillusionments that people have about traditional knowledge? Right, so, and here is the first slide. These are a battery of 9 items. And thank you, Vijay, you spent a few minutes this morning on exactly these findings. And they are fascinating. They form the basis of the current presentation. So I shall briefly recap on them. And here in descending order, we see different promise and reservation attitudes to science and technology. Starting at the highest level here at 76%, science and technology are making our lives healthier, easier, more comfortable. It seems quite obvious that there is wide recognition of that, sure. And then it goes to makes work more interesting, careers suitable for women. That item does not work very well. The others work better, I think. More opportunities for future generations. Yes, affirmed here. We'll see further in the details of this part of the survey that there is also growing cynicism as to the extent to which that is continuing to happen. Benefits for science technology are greater than harmful effects. So this is the 5 items on the promise of modern science and technology for South Africans as represented in the survey. Then there are the reservation side of the findings that we have here. And we get items like South Africans, it makes our way of life change too fast. That is such a common lament that people have about science and technology. Knowledge is result of people, will result in people losing jobs. And let me just get my control slide going here as well. Thank you very much. And scientific advances tend to benefit the rich more than the poor. A fascinating one, here we see is in the middle of the reservations about modern science and technology. And yet just now, when we look at what has been growing, that is the concern about modern science and technology that has been growing fastest in this survey. And that is very significant. And I mentioned this here because this is for me also a very important part of the broader context of this presentation. That South Africans live in a world, not just like Jansi mentioned this morning, of growing right-wing extremism, cynicism about science and technology in that context, but also in South Africa, so much evidence around us of growing disadvantages, growing injustices in society. And we see that science and technology, whatever the detailed reasons may be, but science and technology has often not been helping to get South Africa out of these predicaments of injustices, poverty, etc. And it is in this context that we know there are not immediate cures, and we haven't seen anything in the immediate pipeline with anything that has great credibility and sense of, yes, this is going to happen, this is going to change the quality of life in South Africans. For the bulk of South Africans, we do not see anything in that in the immediate offing. So we have to live and learn to deal with, and for us as this particular specialist kind of community, try to think of ways to address how these changing and continuously changing and often adversely continuously changing socioeconomic conditions in a country will be impacting on attitudes to science and technology and research and development of knowledge in the sense of research, argumentation, theorization that we talk about here. And that is probably one of the biggest challenges that emerge between the lines in this part of the survey. We can then also look at the promise and reservation attitudes towards traditional science and technology or traditional knowledge as it emerges from this survey. There are interesting findings here. Science and technology are making our lives better. No. Sorry about that. Right. Traditional small-scale farming provides healthy food for many South Africans. We see it's right at the top of the list here. Yes, it's important. It is affirmed by South Africans across different demographic categories, as I shall also refer to just now. Very important. But then when we look at change over time, we shall also see that fewer South Africans tend to affirm this belief. And that is also one of the points of concern, one of the points where the additional work will be required. Traditional knowledge provides solutions to issues about the quality of life. I believe in that as well. And as do the others, traditional medicine, home remedies provide better solutions for health problems. So there is a great affirmation by large percentages of South Africans, even if those latter items are going below the 50% of respondents in the survey. There is affirmation, acknowledgement of the value of traditional. And very important, it's a point to bear in mind demographically about the survey findings, and also this part of the survey findings, is that it's not mutually exclusive. It's not as if high belief in modern science and technology means you have a low belief in traditional science and technology. The two often go hand in hand. So that means South Africans who have high appreciation of modern will very often, not always, but very often, also have high appreciation of traditional science and technology or traditional forms of knowledge. And that is very important in sense of seeing that South Africans recognize this complexity of progress and what kind of knowledge brings progress. So on the reservation side of, what are the reservations that South Africans have about traditional knowledge? Here we see just two of them, for example. That would be, I follow the advice of medical experts over traditional healers. 55% agreed with that. So reservations will not go to traditional healers as a first choice. And I trust more in modern science than in traditional cultural practice. Also, over 50% of South Africans who have that reservation. So very complex situations, very complex attitudes that we need to work with if we look at how to move forward. This slide is basically just a different take on what I've just said. And I incorporate this one in my presentation because it shows how small in the right-hand side, the lighter blue shade that we have there, those are the respondents in the survey that disagree. That means, and this is a battery of 9 promise items, promise below, and reservation, the top 4 items about modern science and technology. So there's just small proportions, as you will see in that right-hand side light blue column there, small proportions that say they disagree with that. So especially if we look at that battery of 5 lower items, they're items that depict a promise of science and technology, modern science and technology, small percentages, 13, 18, 14, etc., percent that do not agree with the promise. And that means if one looks at how to further anchor science and technology in broader society, those are probably the groups that will have to be targeted most strongly. And so if one looks also at the demographics, which come later in this presentation, just a brief overview of who is it who harbors certain attitudes, it would be very specific fine-tuning of target audiences that will be required to do additional conversion, because one doesn't want to spend too much resources reconverting the converted, unless there is, of course, some of those who already have positive attitudes towards development of knowledge, science, that they will also need affirmation. And I believe that is also very important in a South African context, that there will be continuous affirmation and reassurances, re-education in a non-patronizing way, but re-education of those who are already converted. Because we see that change, which I shall refer to shortly, and slippage, people becoming more cynical about modern science and technology, given that there are so many societal problems that are not being addressed. We may also ask ourselves how normal, how standard, normal in that sense of the word, how normal are South Africans in having these beliefs? Exceptional and also quite in line with some of the international ones. We see from this graph, from this table, and this is just comparisons with a few of the countries on which data is available. It's not comprehensive, but a few of them on which it is available. South Africa often compares, on a few, can't say often, just on a few of the measures, compares well with a country like Turkey. If one assumes that there are correlations, and there almost inevitably are, correlations between socioeconomic, economic conditions in a particular national setting or country, and the attitudes that people will have. So that makes sense in that way. But generally, South Africa is far more pro-traditional knowledge than international counterparts. And that is very understandable given our mixed cultural background in South Africa, and the human rights culture where we really preach and hopefully quite conform to the precepts of tolerance and advancement of multiculturalism in South Africa, and also the fact that we have such a big class differentiation in South Africa, that South Africans, even if they have the highest order of beliefs in modern science and technology, see and live daily those experiences of high discrepancies, even the ones, to some extent, some of the ones in our higher income quintiles and racial income quintiles that we have. So, but this is fascinating in that way, and I can just point out that faith and change items, by change item I mean modern technology makes our lives change too fast. On those items, we see South Africa quite in line with some of the other international examples. Right, and then I'm going to come to change. Very important slide, I think, here. I mentioned just now, when I referred to the support for the promise of modern science and technology, that some of those items may still be at the top end of the snapshot indications that we get from that survey, but yet they are slipping. And this one is actually slipping very badly. If we look here, by 17 percentage points down from 67. I'm saying down, I must say up here, my apologies, up. Scientific advances tend to benefit the rich more than the poor. Yes, it's the inverse political, economic logic in that. The recognition that it is not a pretty thing, in that it advantage, or is seen to, or people believe it is advantaging the rich much more than the poor. And that perception has been growing by these 17 percentage points. And that is really huge. Even if we take it's a period of about 9 years in this survey from the 2013 to the 2022, that is a huge growth in that, and slippage in the sense that it is a growing negative perception of sciences and technology. We depend too much on science and not enough on faith or religion. That is an interesting one. That has grown by 7 percentage points from 2013 to 2022. And that also occurs across so many different demographic categories. So that is an important one for us to deal with when we look at change and how we can make a difference to embedding science and technology and knowledge in our society. 5 percentage points is a level of growth in the perception that science technology makes our way of life change too fast. And that was also one that occurred across the international dimensions. So this is, yes, very, very important to bear in mind. And the second slide, let me go back there, this slide gives very important elaboration of the previous slide. And the color coding is just an indication of significance, just a middle yellow 2 that we can omit at this stage. But this is very important. You see, and I refer to the same items here, the 17 percentage point rise. Scientific advances tend to benefit the rich more than the poor, very statistically significant. Depend too much on science and not enough on faith or religion, ditto. So all the green ones, as the darker colored, the brownish red ones at the lower end here regarding traditional, also statistically significant. So those are important indications if we start looking at what are we working with, which are the measures that are really the important ones if we want to look at changing attitudes towards science and technology. That will be very important. On this next slide here, this is not percentages. These are indices that have been developed by the research and an analytical team of the survey. And in this, the reservation attitudes are superimposed on the promise attitudes. And so for particular demographic categories in these fields, and it's a dense slide, you will see the details of the slide in your reports that you, in that printed or in the downloaded document. You'll see that there are small differences, like the orange-brown that shows on the right-hand side, shows how much the reservation attitudes, by how much the reservation attitudes are bigger than the promise attitudes. And interesting, in almost all cases they are, except for those 2 cases that we see there when it comes to race and class. And very significant for South Africa, that the extent to which race and class continues emerging and the differentiations, discrepancies continue emerging in the survey as well. So almost all of these cases, the reservations are slightly stronger than the promise attitudes. And that overall brings us to a very, very important point, which actually shows how much work there is to be done in this initiative. It shows us that even if it's marginally bigger, South Africans are marginally, but they are more cynical towards science and technology than they are in affirmation. And that means the picture is not quite as pretty as the opening slides in which we could report these high percentages by which South Africans affirm and endorse statements about modern science and technology. But when the promises and the reservations are pulled together and compared through a very important index like this, it shows us that yes, because we know that there is so much that depends on development of science, technology, advancement of the human condition, to a large extent does depend on that. So one needs to take that forward, and dealing with the attitudes of the host community, that is a very important part of this research. I'm not going to go into the details of these demographics. Let me just jump back for a second into the details of these demographics. But this is a wonderful table. It is in your report as well, which shows which demographic categories are slightly more inclined than others to have certain attitudes. Bear in mind the point that I made earlier, and that was that it's not an either for South Africans, it's not an either or to believe in modern science and technology and to also recognize the importance of more traditional forms of knowledge. So it's not an either or, and so it is quite likely that you will, depending on which attitude you want to work with and whether it's a reservation or a promise attitude, very often it's the same kind of demographic categories that jump out. But if for any specific campaign that specifically wants to target certain constituencies, this would be the go-to, to refer back to these tables in this report. So yes, and thank you. As a bottom line reminder, and I believe these are the questions that will be taken forward in the breakaway sessions too, I trust my inputs here have given a few directions of things that we have to consider in taking forward this work. Thank you very much.